Inconceivable. That is the only word that can be used to describe our first reading today. It's also about love, true love, following God's people. The Egyptian people had been subjected to 10 plagues, and Pharaoh had finally let the Israelites go. But then he sent his army after them to bring them back. An angel of God accompanied the Israelites on their journey, leading them and protecting them. They came to the Red Sea, and Moses stretched out his hand, and God drove the sea back, providing dry land for the Israelites to cross over. The Egyptians pursued them, but God clogged the wheels of the chariots. God then told Moses to stretch out his hand again, and the waters would return and drown the Egyptians. The Egyptians were tossed into the sea. God saved Israel on that day, and the Israelites saw the dead Egyptians. This is part of the ongoing journey to freedom for the people of Israel. Pharaoh had let them go, but not really. He sent his army after them. This is the event where freedom was truly granted to the Israelites. And it came not from Pharaoh, but from God. But while they had been granted freedom from slavery, the Israelites' journey had only just begun. This passage reinforces two important things. First, that the Israelites now feared God because they had borne witness to their saving by God and the destruction and death brought upon the Egyptian army, also by God. Second, the Israelites now believed in God and God's messenger, Moses. These are two separate and important things. God wanted to make sure that they believed because of the difficult journey that still lay ahead of them. But we must remember that this story is also, the story of the parting of the Red Sea is also about the journey to freedom. About God doing the inconceivable. About God's vigilant protection and love in action. A powerful demonstration of the fact that the power of earthly empires pales in comparison to God. And speaking of God's love and power, our gospel passage today reminds us of our continual need to forgive others. This passage follows last week's discussion about dealing with sinners in the church. Peter, as always, comes to Jesus and asks how many times he must forgive, suggesting 7 as a limit. Jesus responds by saying, nope, 77 times. And then Jesus further explained the nature of forgiveness with a parable. A king is settling his debts with his slaves. One owed 10,000 talents, an intentionally absurd and inconceivable amount, and couldn't possibly repay it. The king initially ordered him and his family, all their possessions, to be sold to cover the debts. But the slave begged for patience to be allowed to repay the debt. The king took pity on him and released him from his debt. After that, that same slave came upon another slave that owed him a very small amount and demanded immediate payment. When the slave couldn't repay it, the recently forgiven slave had him thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. The king heard about this and summoned the forgiven slave and questioned why he had not been merciful as the king had been merciful to him. The king then ordered the slave to be tortured forever. This is yet another case where Peter is our stand-in, asking the question that we all have. How many times do we really have to forgive someone? And Jesus' answer, as is all too often the case, is not the one we want to hear. There is no limit to how many times we must forgive. But the flip side of that is there is no limit to God's forgiveness. Both of these facts are downright inconceivable. This call to forgive is central to our faith. God's forgiveness of us, God forgives us, and so we are called on to forgive others. And without us doing the hard work of forgiving others, our faith is cheap and easy. And we must acknowledge that forgiveness is hard. Forgiveness does not mean saying that we haven't been hurt or wronged. Nor does it mean that the wrong done to us wasn't really wrong. Forgiveness requires us to acknowledge our pain, the negative impact on our life. It means leaving behind our resentment and desire for retribution. It isn't easy or trivial. And this kind of forgiveness isn't just about the individual either. Just like last week, the implicit message here is that the community is hurt whenever one of its members is hurt. We are in this life together, and we must care for each other. We are interconnected and are accountable to each other and to God. But again, we must remember the radicalness of this message. Jesus is declaring that forgiveness and not vengeance is to be our foundation. This is a rejection of our human nature, which is to seek vengeance, not forgiveness. Seeking revenge leads to nothing good. Leads to nothing. It's a vicious spiral leading only to death. We are called on to reject our natural tendencies and instead to offer unconditional forgiveness. And to remind you of the power of forgiveness and the cost of vengeance, let me tell you a little story. There once was a boy whose father was a master sword maker. A rich man came and requested a very special sword and promised to pay a high price for it. The sword maker spent a year working hard on this sword, and the rich man came back, but he only offered to pay 1/10 of the cost of the price that he'd offered to pay. The sword maker refused, and so the rich man killed him. The sword maker's son was only 11 years old, and he swore to avenge his father. He dedicated his life to the study of fencing, so that when he saw the rich man again, he could have vengeance. He spent the next 20 years pursuing both fencing and the man who had killed his father. He struggled because there's not a lot of money in revenge. Finally, the swordmaker's son found the man that killed his father, and he said to him, "Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die." The two fight, and Inigo, at one point, is almost losing to the rich man. And the rich man said, "Have you been chasing me your whole life, only to fail now? I think that's the worst thing I've ever heard." Inigo rallies, comes back fighting. He taunts the rich man, tries to get him to bribe him to let him go. The rich man offered him whatever he wanted. And then Inigo finally said, "I want my father back." And he landed the final blow, killing the rich man. Later on, Inigo reflected on what he had done, on how he had spent his life. "You know, it's very strange. I've been in the revenge business so long. Now that it's over, I don't know what to do with the rest of my life." Inigo spent his whole life focused on revenge. So much so that he forgot to live his life. When we hold a grudge against someone, no matter how justifiably, we are giving them power over our life. That is what Inigo did with his lifelong pursuit of the man who killed his father. This story shows us that vengeance isn't the way. Forgiveness is. Today we are being called on to remember that God can do inconceivable things out of love, true love. We are reminded that God calls on us to do the inconceivable, to forgive others, and that we are to live out our lives seeking reconciliation, not vengeance. And so, let us get back to that important and inconceivable work of forgiving others as we celebrate that we too have been forgiven. Amen.